A single server, one pompous billionaire, and a grand piano. What began as a vicious scheme to embarrass her became an incident that hushed the entire establishment and crushed pride. You'll be amazed at how she reversed the situation, using nothing more than her skill. On a balmy Friday night, chatter buzzed through La Fontaine, an elegant eatery nestled in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. The sound of clinking glassware, gentle server footsteps, and distant jazz melodies from a corner piano formed an atmosphere of sophisticated luxury. Deborah, a 25-year-old server with a reserved personality and an unmistakable gleam in her gaze, hurried between tables, managing plates and expressions of courtesy. For most customers, she appeared as simply another uniformed employee, yet within her lived aspirations larger than the opulent restaurant surrounding her. Deborah's true calling wasn't table service, it was musical performance. From childhood, the piano served as her sanctuary, a space for expressing all happiness, all grief, and all silent reflections. However, aspirations cannot cover expenses. Extended hours at La Fontaine represented necessity, a pathway to the musical institute she yearned to join. Only a handful understood her abilities, aside from restaurant personnel who sometimes noticed her finding brief moments with the vintage upright piano in the storage area during breaks. That evening, as the dinner rush settled down, the entrance opened to reveal Leonard Grayson. Immediately identifiable, the affluent businessman entered as if he controlled the space, accompanied by several equally refined associates. Leonard projected an aura of condescension, famous for his cutting remarks and tendency toward drama. His arrival made even veteran staff straighten their postures. Deborah's co-workers shared meaningful looks. Leonard presented challenges as a patron. He was someone who enjoyed testing people's limits for his own amusement. For Deborah, however, he represented merely another table to handle during an extended evening's labor. Yet this would prove far from ordinary. As Leonard surveyed the establishment, his attention fixed on Deborah. Something about her appeared to capture his interest. A brief pause, followed by a knowing grin. Deborah sensed his intense gaze but dismissed it, concentrating instead on water refills and plate clearing. But Leonard had more planned for her. He'd already determined she would provide his evening's entertainment. Deborah's upbringing occurred in a modest South Carolina town where magnificent dreams often seemed as unreachable as celestial bodies. Her mother, raising children alone while working tirelessly as a caregiver, maintained double nursing shifts to ensure Deborah and her siblings had meals available. Despite their limited resources, music remained a household constant. Her mother's vintage record collection and the slightly off-key piano donated by a neighbor planted the seeds of Deborah's melodic passion. That instrument became her escape route. While neighborhood children played outdoors, Deborah devoted hours to self-instruction. She replicated radio songs, then explored classical compositions discovered in used music publications. Her abilities gained recognition. She performed at religious services, school presentations, and local gatherings. Yet acknowledgement couldn't overcome the financial obstacles blocking her aspirations. At 18, reality became apparent. A professional musical career required postponement. Scholarships failed to materialize, and household duties demanded priority. Deborah stored away her performance ambitions, substituting them with the necessity of income generation. Still, she couldn't completely abandon music. The piano represented more than ambition. It defined her identity. Relocating to Raleigh years earlier, Deborah selected employment at La Fontaine, not solely for compensation, but for the grand piano positioned in the restaurant's corner. Though she seldom found time to play it, simply knowing its presence provided comfort. Music hadn't abandoned her, it remained in waiting. That evening, as Leonard and his group claimed their seats, Deborah approached their table, balancing a serving tray with professional skill. Leonard requested premium scotch and delivered a joke audible to surrounding tables. Deborah provided a courteous smile while recording their orders, her voice remaining steady despite the peculiar energy he projected. "Deborah, is it?" Leonard remarked, reading her name badge. "Sounds like someone harboring numerous hidden abilities." The observation surprised her, but she nodded respectfully and withdrew to submit their requests. She missed the conspiratorial smirk he exchanged with his companion and how his gaze tracked her every movement. Leonard wasn't merely watching, he was scheming. Deborah would shortly discover herself central to a performance she never requested. The evening proceeded typically, filled with laughter and silverware sounds. Deborah maintained steady progress, avoiding Leonard's stare as she navigated between tables. She'd handled challenging patrons previously, but something about him felt distinct, not merely discourteous, but strategic. His presence lingered like darkness, creating unease she couldn't quite dispel. By appetizer service, Leonard had begun his show, though not the type Deborah anticipated. He commanded attention at his table, loudly sharing success stories while inserting criticism about individuals lacking drive. His entourage laughed obediently, while other guests cast irritated glances their way. Deborah attempted concentration on her duties, but returning to his table with wine, Leonard surprised her. "Tell me, Deborah," he declared, his voice cutting through surrounding noise. "What occupies your time beyond plate carrying? Surely someone your age harbors aspirations." His inquiry stopped her mid-stride. Deborah paused, then provided a cautious response. "I perform piano occasionally," she whispered, hoping for brevity. Leonard's expression brightened, a cunning smile spreading across his features. "A pianist? How intriguing! Why not provide us with a small demonstration?" Deborah became motionless. The establishment seemed to quiet, his words' impact suspended in space. "Oh, I couldn't," she responded quickly, forcing nervous laughter. "I'm only here for work tonight." But Leonard refused abandonment. "Nonsense," he announced, his voice echoing. "There's an instrument right there in that corner. Display your abilities. Surely a future celebrity like yourself isn't intimidated by a modest audience." His associates chuckled, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Other patrons turned their heads, curious about the disturbance. Deborah's chest constricted. She felt their stares' intensity, the silent criticism waiting to emerge. She wanted refusal to depart, but Leonard's challenge hung in the atmosphere, daring her to meet it or collapse beneath its pressure. "I really shouldn't," Deborah stammered, seeking support, but even her colleagues appeared reluctant to intervene. Leonard reclined in his seat, sipping scotch with a smirk. "Ah, I understand," he said mockingly. "All words, no ability. How disappointing." The comment struck like a blow. Deborah's hands tightened at her sides. She typically avoided confrontation, but his dismissal, treating her like entertainment, a non-entity, wounded more deeply than anticipated. Her mother's voice resonated mentally. "Never allow anyone to diminish you, Deborah. You're greater than they'll ever realize." A silent moment extended between them. Deborah glanced at the piano, then returned to Leonard. His arrogant expression challenged her to accept the provocation, and against better judgment, she did. "Fine," she stated, her voice steady though quiet. "I'll perform." The room tensed with expectation as Deborah approached the piano, each step carrying both fear and defiance. The dining area seemed breathless as Deborah neared the gleaming grand piano. The chandelier's gentle illumination above created a spotlight, separating her from the murmuring audience. Her fingers shook as she settled onto the bench, the polished keys gleaming like a waiting challenge. Behind her, Leonard leaned back confidently, appearing to have already won whatever contest he was conducting. Deborah closed her eyes momentarily, steadying her breathing. Her heartbeat thundered so loudly she could barely concentrate. This differed from church recitals or comfortable community events she'd known. This felt antagonistic, but retreat was impossible now. She positioned her hands on the keys, feeling their cool touch beneath her fingertips. The initial notes emerged softly, tentatively, almost delicately. Several diners shifted position, and someone coughed from the room's rear. Deborah ignored them, her concentration sharpening as she embraced the music. She selected a piece memorized completely, a heartfelt interpretation of Clair de Lune by Debussy. The melody flowed into the space, threading through the air like delicate yet persistent strands. As her assurance increased, the music expanded. Her hands moved with elegance that contradicted her internal turmoil, notes flowing like a personal revelation. Each chord seemed to contain fragments of her history, her mother's sacrifices, nights spent practicing in cramped quarters, the burden of postponed but never surrendered dreams. The guests fell silent, their previous conversation replaced by collective stillness. Even Leonard, who had been whispering to companions, grew quiet. Deborah didn't need to observe him to sense the room's transformation. The mocking atmosphere had vanished, replaced by something indefinable, perhaps wonder, perhaps humbleness. The music soared and Deborah released herself. For the first time in years, she wasn't a server or struggling dreamer. She was simply herself, an artist. Her fingers danced across keys, extracting emotions so intense and vivid they seemed to linger like vapor. When she struck the final chord, the room fell completely silent. Momentarily, no sound existed, only the piano's lingering resonance. Deborah sat frozen, hands still resting on keys, uncertain what would follow. Then, as if released from enchantment, the audience burst into applause. The sound was deafening, echoing off walls and filling the space with unexpected warmth. Some diners rose, clapping with intensity that brought tears to her eyes. Her co-workers, observing from sidelines, joined in, their faces glowing with pride. Leonard, however, remained seated. His smirk had vanished, replaced by an expression Deborah couldn't interpret, part astonishment, part discomfort. He raised his hands and clapped slowly, a hollow sound compared to surrounding cheers. But even his hesitant acknowledgement couldn't overshadow Deborah's achievement. She had reclaimed her voice, and no amount of condescension could steal that away. As applause faded, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Deborah slowly stood, knees trembling but spine straight. She glanced around, and for the first time that evening, she truly observed the watching people, not as spectators but as witnesses. Their expressions carried something new, admiration, respect, and even awe. She didn't immediately look at Leonard. Instead, she offered a small, polite nod to the loudest clappers, her lips forming a faint smile. It wasn't pride she experienced, but relief. Relief that fear hadn't silenced her. Then, as if drawn magnetically, her gaze shifted to Leonard. He remained seated, hands clasped before him on the table. The confident smirk he'd displayed so boldly earlier had disappeared. Instead, his face showed forced neutrality, as though he couldn't decide whether to acknowledge his error or persist in arrogance. "Well," Leonard finally said, his voice louder than necessary, breaking the delicate silence that had settled. "That was unexpected." He chuckled lightly, though it lacked usual confidence. "I suppose talent truly emerges from the most surprising sources." The remark landed flatly. His companions exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. Deborah tilted her head slightly, studying him. His words intended to be a peace offering, but they rang hollow, weighted by his inability to truly own the moment. "Thank you," Deborah replied, her tone steady and purposeful. There was no warmth in her voice, but no hostility either. She wouldn't let him drag her back into the smallness he'd tried to impose. Her performance had spoken louder than any argument she could offer. Leonard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable under the room's collective gaze. He gestured toward a waiter for another drink, a weak attempt to regain composure. "You possess quite a talent," he added, almost grudgingly. Deborah nodded once, her gaze unwavering. "Everyone possesses a talent," she said, her words weighted with meaning. "It's how you choose to employ it that counts." The room seemed to hold its breath again, her response's subtle sting rippling through the air. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it was sufficient. Leonard shifted uncomfortably, his usual dominance slipping further with each passing second. Diners began returning attention to their meals, though the room's energy had shifted entirely. Where quiet privilege and pretense once existed, something richer had emerged, a shared understanding, perhaps even respect for the waitress, who had reminded everyone of authenticity's power. But Leonard wasn't merely humiliated, he was exposed, and no amount of charm could shield him from the truth everyone in the room now perceived. Deborah stepped away from the piano, the moment's weight settling in her chest. Her colleagues greeted her with quiet smiles and subtle, encouraging nods as she returned to her station. She still had work to complete, but something about her posture had changed. Her head was held higher, her movements more purposeful. Leonard's table had quieted. His entourage, who had laughed so freely at her expense earlier, now avoided eye contact, their conversation subdued. The bravado that once filled their restaurant corner had evaporated, leaving only awkward silence. The night continued, but Deborah felt lighter. Each step through the dining room felt more meaningful, her confidence blooming unexpectedly. As she refilled glasses and cleared plates, patrons stopped her with kind words. "You're amazing," one elderly woman said softly as Deborah placed a coffee cup. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so touching." "Continue pursuing this," another man added. "You possess something special. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Deborah thanked them with quiet humility, her heart swelling with gratitude. These weren't mere compliments, they were validations of everything she'd worked toward, everything she'd dreamed of becoming. Leonard, however, showed no such grace. As Deborah approached his table with the check, he looked up with an expression balancing annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he said, his tone sharp. "No need for excessive emphasis." Deborah paused, meeting his gaze directly. "It was never about proving anything to you," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I simply wanted to perform." Leonard had no comeback. He fidgeted with his drink, his once commanding presence reduced to awkward shuffling. The power dynamic had completely shifted, and everyone at the table recognized it. As Leonard signed the check, one of his companions, a younger man with a gentler manner, looked at Deborah and said, "You were incredible, truly." The sincerity in his voice surprised her, and momentarily she glimpsed humanity in a group she had dismissed as superficial. "Thank you," she replied, offering a small smile before walking away. The night concluded with Leonard and his group departing quietly, their usual grand exit replaced by hasty retreat. Deborah watched them leave, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness. She wasn't thinking about Leonard anymore. Her mind had moved to the next step. That night's tips were unusually generous, enough to cover rent and leave extra for piano lessons she'd been postponing. As she locked up and walked home, crisp air filling her lungs, Deborah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: certainty. She wasn't just a waitress, and she wasn't just a dreamer. She was an artist, and nothing, not mocking words, not financial struggles, not fear, could take that from her. But as she walked, her thoughts weren't on the night's conflict. They were on the future, where her dreams finally felt closer than ever. Deborah sat on the worn bench in her small apartment, her fingers gliding over her old, upright piano's keys. The sound wasn't as crisp or rich as La Fontaine's grand piano, but it didn't matter. The music came from her heart, as it always had. That night, something shifted within her, not just a moment of triumph, but a realization that her talent wasn't something requiring hiding or justification. It was hers, and it was sufficient. In following days, the restaurant events became something of a local legend. Patrons who witnessed her performance shared the story, and word began spreading. Days later, Deborah received a call from a man who had been dining that night, a music producer visiting from Nashville. He wasn't offering fame or fortune, but a chance to record a demo, a step toward something she had only dared dream of. Deborah agreed, not because she believed it would change her life overnight, but because it felt like a door opening, one she wasn't afraid to enter. For years, she had allowed fear and doubt to whisper lies, telling her she wasn't enough, that her dreams were too ambitious. But now she saw the truth. Resilience and authenticity were her greatest strengths. The incident with Leonard Grayson wasn't just a humiliating spectacle turned victory. It was a reminder of integrity's power. Leonard, despite all his wealth and swagger, possessed nothing that could diminish her. He represented every voice of doubt she had ever faced, and she silenced him with nothing but her craft's purity. For anyone observing her story, Deborah's message was clear. Never allow someone else to define your value. The world is full of Leonard Graysons, people who project their insecurities onto others to feel powerful. But true power comes from staying rooted in who you are and letting your passions speak louder than their ridicule. As she closed the piano lid and rested her hands on the faded wood, Deborah smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time it felt like it had truly begun. What about you? What dream have you been suppressing because of fear or doubt? Don't wait for someone like Leonard to test you. Take your step forward now. If Deborah's story inspired you, subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph. Your story could be next.